No, no. What I will do is I will cut it in isolation and put it at the very start of the episode without any context at all, because that's what I like to do to my guests. And then the theme tune will hit. So welcome to Thinking Deeply About Primary Education, the podcast that makes time and space to really think about pedagogy, teaching and learning, professional development, anything of interest to time-poor and enthusiasm-rich primary teachers. This week, I'm joined by Neil Almond.
Good to be with you all.
Elliot Morgan.
Hello, everyone.
Adam Smith. And it's the return of the one and only Andrew Jeffrey.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
Now, today we're going to focus on learning objectives. But first, Neil, what you reading for?
Hey, what you reading for?
So I'm revisiting something that I knew there was a lot of information about this particular subject, so I've done my best to kind of read around as much as I could, and that's going back to Dylan Williams' Embedded Formative Assessment book, which is one of those texts that I believe was always on the university to read list, and no doubt I bought the copy because I had a copy of it. Probably didn't read it as much as I should have done on the university course, but no, just really good stuff about formative assessment. That's going to be really helpful for the rest of this chat, and is well worth everyone having a copy of, just to dip in and out of, to look at all things in formative assessment. Elliot, what are you reading for?
Neil's actually stolen mine because I also revisited that chapter from that book. So there'll probably be a bit of overlap in what we say. I'm kind of jealous that was on your university reading list, because our reading list at uni was more like how to teach mathematics in the outdoors and stuff like that. So anyway, I recently just finished though Daniel Williams' Why Don't Students Like School? I know incredibly late to the game there, but I found chapter 2 particularly to be incredibly useful. Anybody who's sort of in the process of designing a curriculum, I think it's essential reading. He's got those tidbits in it that's like factual knowledge precedes skill, and background knowledge aids comprehension, and so on and so on. What about you, Adam? What are you reading for?
Well, I am reading, I've got something I'm actually reading and then something I wish I was reading. So I'm reading The Evidence and Rationale Behind the Step Lab Approach, which is a white paper that's been put out by Ariel Bogoslav and Josh Goodrich, because this weekend myself and Lloyd William Jones, we went to the Step Lab conference near Waterloo Station, and it was really, really, really good, hearing about instructional coaching and the ways that it can be delivered in schools. And one of the sessions there was Josh Goodrich, who set up Step Lab. They used to be called Powerful Action Steps. And it was kind of a preview of a book that he's writing at the moment called Responsive Coaching, that hopefully is going to be out in the next year. And it's going to be like, I know we say things are a game changer all the time, but it's going to be a game changer. It's really, really good. Love that. And then in the meantime, I'm reading this white paper. So to kind of back up the way that they're encouraging schools to do instructional coaching, they've put together this really thorough research paper. And as much as I love reading the paper itself, it's one of those cases where the references are just as valuable as the paper. It's like a really nice summation of all the research that's gone into instructional coaching. And so the references are really good. So I know that's going to inform what I'm going to be reading over the next couple of weeks into the summer holidays. Andrew, what are you reading for?
I'm reading this book, Making Every Math Lesson Count, by Emma McRae. I had the pleasure of, some nods there, of working with Emma at a conference in the Midlands recently. And she's got some great ideas, and she comes from a kind of secondary perspective. But I think a lot of the ideas, such as, challenge and making, I'm really interested in her idea about making a skill very explicit at the moment. That's as far as I haven't got very far into it, but she was kind enough to give me a copy. And I just, it's good and bad, because I was going to do lots of work on the train, but I ended up not. And it's one of those books that you can dip into. You know, there are some that you've got to read front to back, and there are some that you can kind of dip into, like a sort of menu or an art gallery. And this feels like the latter. So I'm kind of enjoying that. Can I have a what I wish I was reading? Adam, is that right? As you have one of those, I wish I was reading the play script of A Few Good Men, because I listened to an Adam Sorokin interview the other day, and I heard he wrote it on cocktail napkins while he was a bartender, and that's kind of you can't handle the truth is kind of one of the great lines, and he wrote it on a cocktail napkin. I kind of love that. I just think it tells me something about the writing process, that sometimes we write. And it's not nice and orderly. You don't sit down and say, I'll write and have a coffee at 9 and write till 10. Sometimes the best ideas come to us at different times. So, yeah, for a totally different reason, that's what I wish. Kieran, what you reading?
Yeah, that's so true, because sometimes you'll be as far from a pen as possible and divine inspiration will come to you, and you think, how quickly can I get back to my notepad or my computer so I can write it down? So I totally get that. I have been reading a blog by Jamie Tom. I think it's on his slow teaching blog, and it's called An Introvert's Guide to Public Speaking. And anyone who's ever spent much time with me will know that introversion is my sort of default mode. And it talks about how in his book, A Quiet Education, he sort of elaborates on how introverts can be really effective public speakers. And he outlines some key points as to what he thinks is important for public speaking and shows how that can marry up. And he says that he talks more about it in A Quiet Education, so I reckon I'm going to probably read that, because I do think that introverts can and should be really good public speakers and really good teachers as well, because sometimes it feels like, you know, it's our profession is the domain of the extrovert, when actually that's not 100% true, because I wouldn't be here and I wouldn't be 15 years in the classroom if it were. So this week we're going to explore learning objectives. And I think my first question, I'm going to throw it to you, Elliot, but then we can bounce it around until we've got a really sort of robust definition. What is a learning objective?
I would say that a learning objective is something that tells the learner what it is they're going to be learning about, or what it is they'll be able to do at the end of a lesson as a result of their interaction with your instruction as a teacher or the task that they've completed. And it may even sort of outline the conditions in which they will do so, like to write a paragraph or something like that. But I also think it's not just a tool for pupils, it's also a tool for teachers, because it helps to guide their instruction and planning.
I think from my university days, where it was very much learning objective heavy teaching, that's a very good, straightforward analysis of what we term learning objective. I'm very happy with that definition.
I think there's also the manifestation of like the learning objective in the classroom. When I knew that we were talking about this, I kind of thought, where do we see it? So it might be written as a title in children's books, it might be on the lesson plan, it might be on the PowerPoint, it might be for the teacher, it might be for the student, it might be for an outside observer, it might be for someone else if you're doing the planning. So I think for me, the learning objective is something that students might write in their book or have in their booklet. But yeah, that might be an interesting discussion, is like, who is it for? Because I like the idea that it's for students, that they can understand and look back and see progress through how they've achieved certain learning objectives over time.
Yeah, I'm really nervous about my floodgates here, because I saw the questions you're going to ask today, and my first response to what is a learning objective was not printable, but my second response was a bit more grown up, and it was a hopeful, paradoxical wish. So I'm going to say it's a hopeful, paradoxical wish, and hopeful because that's kind of the easiest one. Like, I really hope this is what someone else will learn. Wish, because that's kind of it is a wish list. I think a lesson plan is a wish list, but it's part of a lesson plan, and paradoxical in that if I have an objective, then only I can really set myself an objective, and yet students aren't given the chance to set their own objectives. If in this context, in the context of a lesson objective, and I've heard in the past quite sort of sweeping generalizations like, well, how are they supposed to learn anything if you don't tell them what they're supposed to learn? And I think I've learned loads of things, like don't eat chips near a seagull. But nobody told me that I was supposed to learn that. I managed to learn that through the situation. Yeah, I think paradoxical in that I don't believe personally that the objective that the teacher sets is necessarily what the child is going to learn, and also I don't necessarily think that's always a bad thing. I mean, I guess we can all think of examples where some of our kids have gone, oh, and we've kind of gone, oh, great, but I didn't realise you didn't know that. So there is a certain paradox in who sets the objective, and does it mean anything if I set an objective for someone else? And after 30 years in the classroom, I'm still wrestling with that one, if I'm honest. But I love thinking about the question.
Yeah, and I think probably frames this conversation quite well, because from listening to sort of your shared and combined definitions, it's not immediately clear. And my second question is, what is the point or the purpose of learned objectives? And I hopefully we'll be able to tease out as we go through what that might be. And because I'm almost convinced that you can ask two teachers and get two totally different interpretations of what was supposed to be happening. So maybe let's see if we can come to some sort of consensus, just see where the conversation takes us. So, I mean, Adam, what is the point or the purpose of learning objectives?
I guess part of what we do when we teach, so I'm thinking about using like a high quality maths textbook, for example. We might have this like overall idea that children should become fluent in mathematics, and then we sort of divide that down using the national curriculum into certain year groups. So we say by the end of Key Stage 1, they should be able to do X, Y, and Z to meet the expected standard. Year 6, same, Year 9, and on into GCSE. So we then subdivide that down, and then we say, okay, well, if we're going to meet the expected standard in Year 2, here's what we need to start laying the foundations for in reception, same for Year 6. So we gradually start with a massive chunk, break it down. And for me, a learning objective is a useful way of breaking that down into lesson-sized chunks. So I think learning objectives should be very straightforward, and I think they should be achievable, like visibly achievable, if we're going to use them. I ultimately don't. I think almost the term is so tarnished that it would be better to call it something else, or it would be better to refer to it as the purpose of a lesson or something like that. But say, for example, teaching maths today, I wanted my students to be able to round to numbers from 2 and 1 decimal places to 0 decimal places. And that was an achievable learning objective for my students. And it was simple and it was straightforward, and I could look in their books and see by the end of doing independent practice that they'd achieved it. And I knew at the start of the lesson how I was going to model it, scaffold it, do some guided practice on it, and then have that achieved by the end of the lesson. So I guess really utilitarian from my point of view, just as a unit of learning, just as breaking it down into a lesson-sized unit of learning, and then again breaking it down further within the lesson. So it's probably quite a boring answer, so sorry for that. But it's a utilitarian answer.
No, and it wasn't boring at all. And so you're almost one in the camp of it's for the teacher because it helps them organise the journey in their head. I mean, I saw you nodding, Andrew. What were you thinking whenever you were listening to Adam speaking?
Yeah, 100%. I think it's for the teacher. I think I couldn't agree more. I think it's for the teacher. I don't think it's for the student as much as the teacher. I think it really helps the teacher frame what they're going to do. But you'd have to be an incredible mind reader to know what 30 different people are going to learn. Because it's sure as heck won't be that every single one will learn the thing that you wrote, next to the short date, So I'd agree with Adam there. I think that's a really useful way to think about it. It's a tool to help the teacher. I mean, not having an objective for your lesson, that's a disciplinary offence. Surely you should know what the content and what the big ideas are for that lesson. But yeah, but any as I risk of repeating myself, but I'm just going to say, yes, I agree that it is a far more useful thing. It's almost like a list of topics and concepts as much as a learning thing, I think. So yeah, I'd go along with that quite happily.
Yeah, I think I'd to not make this episode even more boring, but I agree as well. I think that's so much more useful for the teacher because it just provides you a mental model, a conceptual framework within the parameters that you actually want to teach the students in that particular lesson. Obviously, fully well knowing that half of them, again, will not learn what you expect them to learn because that's not the way these things work. So definitely useful for the adult. And again, I think you need to make sure you ideally, again, with something like mathematics, you will find your learning intentions from a scheme of work, your learning objectives from there's your other word for it, Adam. That's what I would grew up. It was always the learning intention. It was the LI. We were very much team LI, not team LO when I was training and all of this stuff. But definitely, you want to make sure you have those and they're of vaguely high quality stuff. I'm sure we'll get into the conversation of what makes a good one and what makes a bad one. But you'll definitely kind of want them before planning so you know the parameters with which you're working on within that lesson, so you know how to, where your main focus needs to be. And that transcends, all subjects, but that's what it's there for, so that and if you're in a multi-form entry school, hopefully then your partner teachers know what is going to be happening in that lesson if you have to do some joint planning, and it kind of gives them that parameters of where that lesson is then going on.
I mean, you say boring, but I do think it's important that we establish the point of them, because I dread to think how many newly qualified or early career teachers have wasted time trying to work out how they should write a learning objective, because it can be different in one school from another, and that's missing the point, and it's focusing on the wrong stuff, So I think if we could have this shared understanding across the profession that here is the reason we do this and here is why it might be useful, that can never be boring, So don't sell us or yourself short.
Like, going back to the sort of central question of like, what is the purpose of them? Intuitively, it just seems sensible, doesn't it, that if people like that, people should know what they're learning, and that the more clearly we communicate that to them, perhaps the more likely they are to then go and learn it. And like, we could as well believe the opposite to be true, that the more confusing the learning objective is, then the less likely they are to learn it. So yeah, ultimately, as everybody said, learning objectives help to frame the learning for the teacher and the pupil, because learning is a sort of goal-directed activity. We're trying to take pupils from A to B, whether that be within an individual lesson or across a unit. So for the teacher, it informs their instruction, and the pupil, it sort of guides their effort and thinking. And I say it sort of like frames their learning because, as Andrew alluded to, like, learning can and will occur without LOs or with them. Learning isn't reliant on there being an LO that's presented at the start of a lesson with 3 success criteria and so on. To sort of hark back to Adam's point about like, who is it for? Well, they're like, I see learning objectives as sort of a means through which to assess. So like, from a summative standpoint, they're for the teachers to help us to see if a learner has understood a lesson or not. But from a sort of formative standpoint, they help the learner in the moment to guide their understanding. It helps them to go and understand. But I think that's only true if a teacher has built up a sort of very specific culture around how the learning objectives are used in their lessons. I'm not convinced that with very, very young pupils that it would have that effect, but perhaps with older secondary pupils, it could. So yeah, I'd say it's definitely for both the teacher and the pupil.
Yeah, Neil's point was great about worrying, and your point about worrying about how should I frame it. I think that's broadly true in a lot of stuff that early career teachers feel they have to do in order to get myself in trouble here, but in order to fit in with the culture of the school, which is based on that particular ideology. I mean, the number of forms that we have to fill in and amount of data that we have to submit, and in the best schools that's used to inform next steps, but in in quite a lot of schools I suspect it's used to conform, not inform. And if we could spend less time proving and more time improving, I think we'd be a lot better off. So I think if we're doing learning objectives because we have to do them in this way or that way because that's how somebody high up in our organisation believes we should do them, then we're less likely to get the benefit. Morgs was saying, that there is benefit. The older the pupil, the more benefit maybe there is from being explicit. Although I suspect we'll find out later on, not always. But I think if we can spend time improving rather than proving and justifying, I think the world will be a happier place. So I'll get back in my box now.
Also, when we think about purpose, certainly as when I was a teacher, not in any leadership position, I did kind of feel half the time the purpose was it was used for leaders to triangulate, my teaching. Was I doing the right thing? Was I teaching the things? And the way, because we'd have to, you'd have some really long learning objectives, which I don't think are particularly useful for the pupils to know. I would definitely want to know if I am going to be doing mental addition bridging through 10 with year 3, for example. Therefore the purpose is not that 15 minutes of my 40-minute mental maths lesson is spent the children and literally have to write out LO to bridge through 10 when adding. But I was certainly coming up through education at the point where children would have to write that learning objective down in their book, because if it wasn't and the maths leader did a book look or a book scrutiny, I'd be picked up with the fact that there's no learning objective. The students definitely don't need to write that all out. If you're desperate for a title or something like that because you need to disprove that you are actually teaching children, then just get them to write addition down. There's no need. The fact that they write that down, bears no resemblance to what they won't learn it any better because they've written it down. And actually, you could actually find 10 more minutes worth of practice by not getting them to write tens of words down, whatever it might be. So when we think about the purpose again and the point, not something for the children, certainly not something to prove to management, something for the teacher to know so they know what they are doing at that point in that learning sequence.
I think we'll talk about it a bit later, but about the time input versus the purpose. So for me, I'm fully willing to say that it's for my own benefit that I have these learning objectives, because I like to be able to see in a book what we were doing at any particular time, and if there's a book scrutiny, it provides useful context for me and for leadership to be able to say, well, look, in this lesson we were doing this was the particular outcome that we were aiming for. But I teach upper key stage 2, so that's not really a massive issue in terms of the time input. It's not an issue, because I think I read somewhere earlier, it might be David Didal's blog, that if it takes 3 minutes a lesson to handwrite a learning objective, then it actually adds up to 50 hours a year, or 10 full school days basically a year. So it's quite a big time input, and the benefit of that, we'll get on to talking about it later, is probably decreases massively. And one of the reasons why this was a big fad, sort of back in the, I don't want to call it the dark age, but back in kind of 2007, that sort of mid and early 2000s period, is because I think people did perceive it as being a benefit to the students. Like, they did think that this was something that provided clarity to students on what they were working on, or it helped students to understand like their learning journey or whatever it was. And I think now we should be open and honest and say, look, if we're writing learning objectives, then we're doing it for the benefit of organisation, which I think is fine. I think it's fine to aspire to have organised exercise books with neatly written dates and titles. Like, I'm not a teacher who thinks that is a waste of time. I think that's a good skill for students to learn. and we're doing it for the purpose of context, so that when we do book looks and scrutinies or whatever it is, that represents what's actually happening in the classroom, and maybe for accountability. We want to make sure that if we say to teachers that you have to teach this entire textbook, that we can look back through, say, a maths journal or a history exercise book and check to make sure that all those lessons have been taught in the correct sequence. Yeah, as long as we're open and honest about that being the purpose, and not trying to make out as if getting a year 4 student to write, I can identify the parts of a sentence, is going to somehow actually improve their ability to do that later on in the lesson. I think that's not helpful.
We have a textbook in place that provides pupils with a pupil book, and so there isn't actually a space for them to write an objective, even if we wanted them to. There is space for the date, but almost without anyone realizing, we sort of phased out the need for, like Neil says, about having to spend 10 minutes of your day writing things out. So I do think your point's pretty important, Adam, in terms of if it's a bureaucratic decision or a big picture decision, then potentially, we can use it. But I do think it is possible to not have them formally written down anywhere, but still have a focus for the lesson or a purpose for the lesson, like we've mentioned.
I think in that scenario, it is a real benefit of, so we use Maths No Problem. Maths No Problem doesn't have a learning objective, it just has a title for each lesson. And the only lesson I actually get students to write learning objectives in is English, because that's when they use their exercise book. We're a very booklet heavy school, so in every other lesson there is a learning objective, but it's already pre-printed. If I was, and I might even potentially think about doing this next year, but we obviously all of our planning is then done really far in advance. So even if we were using exercise books, I would consider having almost like a contents page of like lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3 pre-printed with what those lessons are going to be about, to avoid the need to write a title. Obviously that restricts your ability to be flexible. You would have to kind of maybe be flexible towards the end of that scheme, or just accept that is going to change and you're not going to necessarily strictly stick to it. But it might be a solution to have a sort of pre-printed list of objectives, and you might even be able to, like, I'm just going full like nerdy bureaucrat here, like this is the kind of thing that I love. You could even like have lesson 1 to 6, and they literally just write L1 in their books, and then it refers back to it. And then if you do any kind of interstitial lesson, so if you do anything that slots in between those, or if you repeat a lesson or a lesson goes over, you just write like L1A, or you can write a new learning objective in. Okay, so there we go. There's a way to save time actually physically writing a learning objective.
I mean, that's certainly more bureaucratic than I would be. I essentially say to my teachers, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, it's just different. I say, okay, right, we're going to start in December of year 1. You're going to finish in February of year 6. Here's the start, here's the end. Off you go. And then, when we're having our transition meetings at this time of year, I'm saying, okay, well, where are we going to start? Well, we're not necessarily going to start with place value in September. We're going to start where you left off at the end of year, say you're going to year 4. Well, where'd you finish year 3? Because then, that way you do have that flexibility. But I do understand that in certain parts of my professional life, I do like that kind of control and that detailed oversight. So I'm not saying that as a, you're wrong, Adam. It's more a case of, this is an alternative. I hope it didn't come across like that.
I'm desperately upset now. I mean, the fact of not teaching place value in September, I think my head might fall off. Oh dear. It's place value. I think they should change the name of the month to place value month. Let's just get it out of our system.
So I think we're probably about halfway through the episode. And so at this point, I'd like to thank everyone who supports us on Ko-fi, because they've been able to provide us with this wonderful sort of podcast recording studio, that we're in virtually now. And hopefully you will see better audio quality, better video quality on your end. But I can tell you at the moment, it's a bit of a struggle to see the light at the end of the tunnel. But no, we really appreciate you, everyone who listens. And obviously, if you do want to support some coffee, lots of behind the scenes stuff and extra CPD for people if they want to engage that during the summer. So then the next question, Andrew, I wrote specifically based on having listened to you speak in the past. And my question is there ever a case for not sharing the learning objective with pupils?
If ever you thought you were being set up. There's that famous lawyer, isn't there? Have you stopped beating your wife? Yes or no? Well, you know jolly well. I mean, I've actually had the privilege of teaching a lesson in your school, Kieran, in the relatively recent past, and you'll be acutely aware that I chose not to share the learning objective, which not that it matters, but was all about efficient ways of adding commutatively, and in that particular lesson. The quickest way to ruin the lesson would have been to share the learning objective. Yes is my emphatic answer. That particular lesson in question just came to mind was that the children had to add up some numbers as quickly as they could. And in one case, it was the numbers 1 to 10. And as they were coming into the room, if you probably recall, I gave them 10 playing cards with the numbers 1 to 10 and asked them to add them up. And I was walking around the room seeing whether anybody was putting them into pairs, so that kind of informed my the route that I would take, almost like a sat nav says in live time. Oh, this route would be quicker, or this route would be slower, or there's a traffic jam here. And I did actually notice one couple of children that put the cards into pairs. And that sort of informed the route I was taking. So, yeah, the short answer is 100%. There are some times when lesson design is improved by not sharing your objective. Yeah, for sure.
I 100% agree. It's one of the bits in that Dylan William book, Embedded Formative Assessment, that he mentions how, in what he saw, which is very much American-based observations, but I think there are definitely parallels over to here in England. This idea of very much like wallpaper learning objectives, where it was very much it's on the board. When the kids come in, they write it down, well, like we just talked about, and then he goes in to say, well, actually, sometimes, particularly I think with like mathematical problem solving, if you're saying, today we're going to solve problems with the area of a triangle, well then actually you've taken a lot of that learning away from them, because you've told them straight away you're going to have to use the area of the formula for the area of a triangle to work these problems out. How much more richer and fuller would that lesson have been if here are some problems, take 15 minutes, see if you can work them out, what do you notice, all of that kind of thing, and then introduce the learning objective. Right, we need to, for some people that might be like, oh, okay, right, that's the prompt that they need to then go on and have a look and be able to solve it. Some of them, some students might say, oh, I've done 2 of these problems already, and I've had to use the formula for working out the area of the triangle on it. So is that what we're doing today? So I definitely think going straight in with the, this is the learning objective of the lesson first thing can definitely, spoil that learning journey that you are trying to create for those pupils.
There's also a case for not sharing them when they're just poorly written or just poorly used. So Neil mentioned the Dylan William book earlier, Embedded Formative Assessment, and I'm just going to sort of touch on a couple of things that are in that book. So Shirley Clark talks about the idea of that sometimes learning objectives get confused with the context of learning in which they're being used. So like a common sort of learning objective you might see at primary is something like to write instructions on how to pump up a bicycle tyre. And it's like the actual learning objective there is to understand how to write instructions. The bicycle tyre is just the context in which it's being taught. And by putting it in there, sometimes pupils can confuse their learning with thinking it's just singular and to that context. And obviously that can be troublesome when we want to facilitate transfer long term. And I think Dylan William also talks about the idea of wallpaper objectives, the idea that you just show it at the start, as Neil said, and then never really touching it again. In my mind, that's kind of pointless. Referring back to it is going to make it much more impactful for learning.
Elliot, that's bang on. In that book you mentioned earlier about why don't students like school, Willingham talks about this brilliant example where his students are measuring the area of their desktop in the classroom, and they finish, and by way of in quotes extension unquote, the teacher says, "Okay, so now what about the football field?" And they go, we haven't done football fields. and so that's exactly what you're talking about, right? It's kind of completely, well, I thought we were talking about desks, they have completely failed to understand that the objective was rectangular areas and, the amount of flat squareness is what constitutes an area, regardless of size. So that's kind of really reminded me of that brilliant book you talked about earlier.
I think at the heart of it, some of the most profound truths, a really well crafted sequence by the teacher, allow the truths to reveal themselves. If we think about, I always talk about Watson and Mason and their non-Euclidean circle, and they sort of convinced these teachers that they were making a straight line, but actually no, it was making a circle in taxicab geometry. And if I think about Andrew, whenever we see you with the algebraic reasoning, particularly at Maths Conf 29, and we sort of brew out maths where the envelopes and the idea of knowns and unknowns, if you tell a pupil, right, today we're going to learn about unknown quantities, that's not going to mean much, but actually the 4 or 5 steps you take the adults in the room through, they just sort of, all these connections start pinging at the same time, and you can see it on their faces. I know certainly whenever I saw the first time, I was like, oh my goodness, yes, that makes so much sense. I think if you do say at the start, right, we're going to learn about algebra, you probably lose half the class and 100% of the the magic, no pun intended, in the lesson. And I think it definitely applies outside of mathematics, but I think lots of us on this call sort of default to the most important of the subjects.
Maybe it's the romantic in me, but if I wanted to convince you to climb a mountain with me by telling you the view would be awesome, to show you a photograph of the view beforehand would feel as kind of like a bit counterintuitive, really. I want you to enjoy the climb, as Miley Cyrus would convince us.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. If I saw a view, I might not be as eager to climb a mountain afterwards. So, all this considered, Adam, how can we improve the cost-benefit ratio that's sort of inherent within learning objectives?
Again, I am very much like, this is for the purpose of teachers, bureaucracy, leadership, organisation, not of a great import to students. So wherein the benefit is clearly, wherein the cost is really eating into lesson time, children aren't drilled in this, the routines aren't in place for this, the quality, like the tidiness of it, for me, part of that start of year routine is like, look, we orient our title on the left hand side of the page and our date on the right hand side of the page. We underline them neatly with a ruler. I reckon I can get my entire class to write the date and title in maybe a minute and a half, 2 minutes. Don't come to my classroom with a stopwatch and check that, but it's it's pretty speedy by year 5 and year 6. So that to me isn't a great concern, but certainly if I was a year 2 teacher and someone was asking me to write lengthy multi-word learning objectives, I would say that there is a huge cost benefit issue there. So stickers, I don't know, I'm sure you all have opinions on this. Pre-printed stickers, I have no issue with them whatsoever if you can do them quickly. So for example, like the start of the year is coming. I've already done all my book labels for next year in like a nice, they all look lovely in uniform, because I'm a nerd like that and I want everything to look lovely in uniform on the front of books. And if we didn't have maths textbooks, I would happily print out a date and LI on a little sticker to go in books, and I would get my students like trained into a routine of like, take a sticker, pass it back, take a sticker, pass it back, stick it in, something along those lines. But I'm sure that is it feels faddy. It feels like a callback to to yesteryear having LI stickers, but maybe it's actually the future. Maybe it's where we go from here, especially as technology improves. Although technology may improve, but printers don't seem to improve. I think printers are as bad now as they've ever been. So
to improve the cost-benefit ratio for learning objectives, I think I've sort of three sort of separate areas come to mind. So firstly, using them for assessment. If you are going to use them where children self-assess or peer assess, make sure that you explicitly teach the assessment process before you get to do so, especially with young children. They're just going to tick it and say that they have met it. If you're using them with older pupils, have dedicated feedback sessions after the lesson where you go back and revisit the learning objective and talk about whether pupils have been successful or not, and put that responsibility on pupils for the self-checking and editing and so on. The second one is differentiating. I would advise against differentiating learning objectives. I think that just presents a huge workload issue, and it also ends up leading to very ambiguous learning objectives across a single lesson. Instead, think about how you differentiate the level of support you give. And then finally, touching on what you alluded to earlier, Kieran, don't use really complicated language or get bogged down in terminology. I think when I think back to being in secondary school in sort of the early 2000s, I think Bloom's taxonomy was back at its height. And we had these very overly specific verbs, like to be able to refine or to analyse. And it made learning objectives very skill heavy and perhaps more sort of student centred than was necessary. And I don't think we need to worry too much about that, because as Andrew said earlier, the learning can occur, learning objective or not. It's just there as a sort of frame of reference for the learning overall. So don't get too bogged down in those learning objectives. And then sort of lastly, leaders, don't worry if learning objectives aren't in books. Learning can still occur, as we just said. And alongside using a learning objective, I think it's quite useful to make it clear what successful learning looks like in that lesson against that learning objective, because it can act as sort of like a tool of immediate feedback for pupils.
I think to increase, the cost benefit of them, don't write them down in books. I think, the title is more than adequate. If you're learning adverbs, you don't need to write, to use adverbs of manner, LO to use adverbs of manner in a sentence correctly, just write adverbs of manner. It should be pretty clear from the outcome what's actually happening in that lesson. I don't really buy them as a particularly useful tool to kind of hold teachers account to in terms of, what they've been attempting to teach the children. I think what we can also kind of do is kind of make sure that they are process focused and not product focused. What I mean by that is that I see many learning objectives that confuse the particular task with the particular objective, which I don't think is particularly useful, because it goes back to why you write. If your LO is to write a letter, well, you're going to have written a letter in the book, so it should be pretty clear that you've written a letter. You don't need to then write, our learning objective is to write a letter. Your learning objective for there is thinking about, well, what actually skills have you, or what bits of writing procedural knowledge have you taught the children, so that they can actually apply what they've learned perhaps in the context of a letter. So if you had to have a learning objective, that in the teacher's head, it should be, to apply the skills of fronted adverbials and subordinate clauses at the beginning of a sentence in the context of letter writing. But obviously that is still, far too much for actually the children to write down. And it's something that I do see kind of quite often, this idea, we get that our learning objective, it gets confused with the task itself. I'm far happy with the idea of going back to the example that I used earlier. I may want to teach, mental addition through bridging through 10, but equally, by doing that, that is the task. My actual learning objective for them is to be able to add 2-digit numbers effectively, or 2 digits and 1-digit number effectively, using that particular method. So I would say just be really clear that they are process focused and not product focused.
That's the focus of a big part of your task design talk, Elliot? What should people who are interested in what Neil's just said be reading?
There's something sort of similarly linked to that, which is by Wiggins and McTighe, which is the twin sins of curriculum design. And I think it's one is being activity focused, so you're perhaps too focused on what the task is like and how engaging it is, and the other sin I believe is being too coverage focused, so trying to get through content really quickly simply because you have a curriculum that you have to get through, and it's at the expense of any sort of depth.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That reminds me of something I wrote down earlier, which is a really powerful quote from Caleb Gattegno, who said, "The power to learn rests primarily with the learner." So actually, if we're really honest with ourselves and we look in the mirror, we should stop lying to ourselves and stop calling them learning objectives and start calling them teaching objectives. But actually, I don't know, listening to what you guys just said there, I wondered about, I wanted to say many things. It was so sort of thought provoking. But could we get rid of it all and just have the lesson with which is called today's big idea : which allows you to make your own meaning from it and your own sense. But again, always with that underpinning, that Adam started us off quite rightly with. We need to know what we want them to know, but it is at best what we hope they will. That was fascinating. Honestly, there's so much there. I often say to schools and to heads, think about all the procedural stuff that happens in your school. And every school, there are thousands of little things on there. But I've always asked myself two questions. Do they improve attainment? And or do they improve well-being? And if you can't answer yes to at least one of those questions, and maybe both, you really need to consider why you're doing it. And I think that's not to say that we shouldn't have some kind of objective. Of course we should. But Neil's idea about are you thinking about an objective or actually thinking about an outcome? Its outcomes is there something we know that we didn't know before? Is there something we can do that we couldn't do before? Is there something that we understand on a deeper level? I think all of those things are important, but sometimes we can make progress without showing progression. Like, I can feel more confident on this rung of the ladder than I was before, but I'm still on this rung of the ladder. I think I might have talked about this stuff before. And the terminology, sorry, cut as much of this out as you want. the terminology, I think Elliot talked about, the language. If I come up with an objective, right, today, kids, we're learning about square numbers. Now, there's two groups of kids in the class. Ones who think they know what they are because their dad told them, and ones who go, what the heck is a square number? And they're kind of on the back foot. There's nothing to hang that on. So I'd much rather make squares out of tiles and go, well, you can make squares out of 9, but not 8 or 10. I wonder why that is, and then come to the terminology later. But yeah, I think I definitely, having listened to everyone, I would change it to today's big idea, and get them to the point where they wanted to know what today's big idea was. That would be my optimum. Yeah, if they were excited to know what the big idea was, then I think maybe we're maybe somewhere along the right lines.
With my coherence hat on, I'm thinking something like maths, which you can distill to some fundamental big ideas. Perhaps those, when you use real minute learning objectives, the big ideas are lost within those. Whereas if you just called addition for all the things that you did that included addition, that idea is potentially could be far clearer. And I mean, you're doing that for when it comes to adding fractions, when it comes to adding decimals, when it comes to teaching addition through bridging through 10, whatever it might be. But if you're just doing to add unit fractions, or to add fractions where the denominator is the same, and then you have another one to add fractions where the denominator is a multiple of another denominator, etc. If you just call it addition, then actually maybe children are far more likely to see that consistent element of what addition actually is, rather than just being a symbol that has 2 lines in it and, oh yeah, I do this and that means I do that. I don't know, just thinking out loud there, because what Andrew said made me think, which is why I love doing this.
I was just wanting to come back on something that Elliot said, because so far we've talked about learning objectives, intentions, whatever you want to call them, as quite benign things. So there might be a tiny bit of a waste of time and a bit of a pain in the bum, but they are quite, benign, and maybe they're a good thing and maybe they're not. But actually there's two things that I think are actually really negative. So when we're thinking about cost benefit, this is actually, taking it's bad essentially. And number one would be what Elliot touched on slightly, which is differentiated learning outcomes. Now I know these are so old hat, but actually having visited quite a lot of primary schools recently, they're not dead, they're still out there. And I'm talking about your must, should, could. So your sort of all students will be able to achieve this, your mid-level students will be able to achieve this, and your gifted and talented students will be able to, actually do cube numbers by the end of the lesson as well as squared numbers. And that's massively damaging to your classroom environment, because you're explicitly saying that there is knowledge in this lesson or process in this or product in this lesson that is out of reach for certain students in this class. And that so then I think the thought occurred to someone at some point, well, what if they didn't know which students in the class would be able to achieve what? So one of my favourite little mutant things that popped up when I was searching for something a while ago, I won't be too specific because I don't want to upset the person who made it, was must, should, could differentiated learning outcomes, but instead of green, yellow and red, they were blue, green and purple, so that children wouldn't recognise that if they could meet the green one but not the purple one, that was somehow, there was no value judgment because they were just green. And my other massive mutation on that is maybe it was just a secondary school thing, but using the Nando's scale of extra hot, mild, lemon and herb. And I will confess, I didn't qualify that long ago, not long ago enough for this not to be massively embarrassing, that I have used the Nando's scale before in my planning very early on in my career. And I've said, oh, you've met the lemon and herb objective. Can we reach for the mild? Can we reach for the medium? And then the other thing was just a quick one on dead time. So my big bugbear with writing a lesson, learning objective in a lesson, particularly if it's long, I'm so in favour of keeping them short and basically titles with LO written in front of them, is dead time. So you can only progress in your lesson as fast as your slowest writer. So if you have to wait for them to write a full sentence, and quite often someone who needs prompting to pick up a pen, open the exercise book, do all this. So I hate dead time. I hate transition time, and there's nothing useful you can do with that dead time. It's a minute 30, 2 minutes, 2 minutes 30 of just pure dead time in which behaviour deteriorates and no learning happens. So I just wanted to put forward that actually, although we've approached it as quite a benign topic, there are two things that I think are actually negatives that we need to consider when we're thinking about learning objectives.
I mean, just to add one more, can it really be a learning objective if there are not at least, 5 success criteria that then follow it on for how to meet that learning objective?
That is really, really important, because there will be teachers out there who have to do this, and like you say, Andrew, who they must conform because their livelihoods depend on it. And the more school leaders we can reach who will sort of accept that there is a point, but only a point if it's done sort of in a way that sort of makes it manageable for the teachers, then fewer teachers will hopefully be in that situation. I think it's really amazing that Caleb Coutinho potentially said the quote about the responsibility of the learner, Andrew, close to 70 years ago at this point. My timeline's off, but I know he was sort of very active in maybe the 50s, 60s, 70s, at the sort of peak of his career. But also the people that we've been talking about tonight, like William and William, they talk about how it's the change in the learner, and it's the learner's responsibility. What they pay attention to, they will remember, and the residue of thought, and that kind of thing. So we have this sort of expansive understanding of the ways that pupils should be involved in their learning. And so really the question that listeners need to ask themselves is, are learning objectives an important part of that? And if not, can they become important? Or are they superfluous to our requirements? And I think what you guys have done is you provided sort of really rich and varied experience on which our listeners can draw. So I'm really, really grateful for that. And I think we've almost come to the conclusion that we must have an episode on differentiation, because, you know, it's been spoken about quite a lot. You know, I know that knowing what your practice looks like, you know, you won't fall into the category of having 6 different objectives for the one lesson.
We should have 3 episodes on differentiation. One for the really intelligent teachers, one for the majority of teachers, and then one for the really thick teachers where we could use really short words. Okay.
That's excellent.
Cold drop.
I'm so sorry. You can either cut that out or just say irony alert in case I just get kicked off every possible forum ever. Sorry, I'll shut up.
No, what I will do is I will cut it in isolation and put it at the very start of the episode without any context at all, because that's what I like to do to my guests. And then the theme tune will hit. But yeah, our listeners appreciate that. Yeah, it's tongue in cheek, but if we either laugh or cry, you know. So those are our 2 options. All that's left to do, you know, looking forward to that differentiation episode. All that's left to do is say thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much, Adam.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me. Enjoyed the conversation, guys.
Thank you, Neil.
It's been a pleasure to be back.
And thank you, Andrew.
That's a joy as always, Kieran. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone at home, until next time, thanks for listening.